Well, welcome to our first lecture series. We're happy to have you here. Glad we have so many enthusiasts to learn about Tlingit culture and history. My name is Rosita Worrell. I am the president of the Sealaska Heritage Institute. We think it's a very exciting organization, and we're going to be doing some great things in the future, and I hope you guys are going to be watching that lot across the street, because we're going to be building a Sealaska Heritage Institute center there. We are naming it after our chair, our previous chair, Dr. Sobolov. We think it's just a wonderful tribute to a man, a great and honorable man, and this is certainly worthy, I think would be a tribute to him. So we hope that you'll be watching that and supporting us in our efforts. We may be calling upon individuals to support us as we can't go back to the legislature anymore for money. They told us that last year. But we're going to find other ways of being support. We're hoping that we could call on you. The Sealaska Institute, has evolved from its origin. When we first started, we were really engaged in primarily restoration, and we want to thank Dick and Nora for the works that they did in this early effort. That's Nora standing up with mutton stew on her shirt, and Dick Downhauer. They produced, the notable publications that we have that really set the groundwork for the Sealaska Heritage Institute. But about 12, 15 years ago, our Board of Trustees decided that they would make a change and really wanted us to move into the area of language restoration. That was our highest priority. And so we moved, and at that point in time, we had the works of Dick and Nora in their publications, but we didn't have language programs. And now we're happy to report, that we do have language programs in about 10 different communities, varying kinds of programs. We know that there's still a long way to go, but we've raised it to a national issue. So we have increased funding for our language efforts. And I wish you guys could have heard a ceremony in which we participated this last weekend, in which we had several young speakers. And it was really, really a joy to be able to hear some of those young individuals speaking in Tlingit. I think that there wasn't a dry eye there in that group. I also want to acknowledge Clarence Jackson here. Clarence, sitting here. Clarence, want to raise your hand? Clarence is a leader in his clan from Cape, but he is also the chair of our Council of Traditional Scholars. We are governed by a Board of Trustees, but we also have a Council of Traditional Scholars that make sure that we're doing the right thing. We want to maintain integrity, cultural integrity of our programs. And so that council is responsible for setting the direction for us in some of our programs, but also reviewing some of our work just to make sure, that we're doing the right thing. Well, today we're very, very privileged to have Emily Moore to talk about totem poles in Southeast Alaska. This is a really exciting time for us because these were done, in the 40s. They were brought out from the villages, and it created a real stir among our people because totem poles are owned by clans, and they had to make the decision, who can give the permission to bring these poles in. There's some controversy about how some of them were brought in, but nevertheless they were brought in. They preserved for us a real important part of our history. And right now we're already beginning to duplicate some of those poles that were brought in from the outlying areas. But one of the things that we do is we sponsor a visiting scholars program. And we've been fortunate in having someone from Oxford University come and study biomass. We've had another scholar come and talk about or study button blankets. We've had visiting scholars come and study our language. And what we require of them is not only their research papers, but we ask them to do a lecture for us. And so with that, I'd like to bring up Emily and just let her get started on her lecture. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers afterwards.
Thank you, Rosita. Thank you, Rosita. And I would like to thank all of you for coming out today, and to Sealaska Heritage Institute for welcoming this research. I especially want to thank Zachary Jones in the back there, who really expedited my research by guiding me through the archives. So thank you to all of you for coming. My talk this afternoon focuses on the role that Tlingit and Haida leaders played in the creation of 6 totem parks established in the late 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. If I could have the slide. Most people are familiar with the totem parks at Klawock, Wrangell, Klawock, Kassan, Heidelberg, Totem Bight, and Saxman. Next slide. As well as totem poles in the Sitka Park that was established in 1902 by John Brady and that the CCC helped to restore. And there were also 3 poles here in Juneau carved by the CCC. The next slide, please. What many people do not realize, however, is that these totem parks were originally established during the Great Depression as a work relief program through the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC was the hallmark of President Roosevelt's New Deal to give Americans jobs during the Great Depression. And in Alaska, it employed more than 250 Alaska Natives at various camps across the territory. The Totem Pole Restoration Project in Southeast Alaska was the largest of the Alaska CCC programs, and it was administered by officials with the U.S. Forest Service under the direction of Regional Forester B.F. Heinzelman. Next slide, please. I grew up in Ketchikan, so I was always interested in these parks. But when I got to graduate school, I realized there was no in-depth study of the CCC project or of the many individuals who worked to make this project happen. Who were the people involved in these parks, natives and non-natives? Why did the Forest Service and Tlingit and Haida people decide to cooperate on a restoration program at the same time that they were involved in major disputes over title to the Tongass National Forest? For that matter, why did the government support totem pole restoration at all in the 1930s, when for decades it had worked to assimilate native peoples and to suppress totem pole carving and potlatching? None of these questions seem particularly well answered in existing scholarship, so I decided to make the totem parks the subject of my dissertation. And I especially wanted to know about the role Tlingit and Haida individuals had played in the CCC parks, since it seemed to me that their role in shaping the totem parks was almost unmentioned in existing scholarship. Next slide. So before we get too far into the talk, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview on the CCC totem parks. There were 6 parks established in the late 1930s: Saxman, Totem Bight, Klawock, Kassan, Heidelberg, and Wrangell. Also poles restored at the Sitka Park, 3 poles for Juneau, and 1 totem pole restored for Seattle, for a total of 121 totem poles restored, replicated, or created by the CCC. Next slide, please. This project was very involved, and what it involved first was identifying 19th century totem poles for restoration by the CCC. So the Forest Service would take their ranger boats, which you can see here, and they would voyage to what they called abandoned native villages, which we know were not abandoned, but were uninhabited as Tlingit and Haida peoples moved to larger communities for jobs. The Forest Service would take photographs of these poles, and they made an archive of totem poles that they wanted to restore when they received federal funding through the CCC. Next slide, please. The next step was to meet with Tlingit and Haida leaders to identify owners of the totem poles and to get permission to move the totem poles for restoration. Importantly, the Forest Service recognized that totem poles were owned by Tlingit and Haida people, even if they did not recognize their claim to land in the Tongass National Forest. The Forest Service also recognized multiple owners of clan property and tried to ensure that all possible claimants signed a Memorandum of Agreement authorizing restoration of the poles. So here you can see C.M. Archbold. He was an official with the Forest Service, meeting with elders in Wrangell, Joe Thomas on the left, and Charlie Jones there in the middle, to try to identify who the owners of the poles were, who they had to get permission from. Next slide, please. The Memorandum of Agreement that the Forest Service signed with Tlingit and Haida peoples were very important because they spelled out 3 radical changes for totem poles in Southeast Alaska. If you could press the next button. They argued that totem poles should be preserved rather than allowing them to decay naturally, as was tradition. Second thing was that they agreed to relocate totem poles from native villages, removing them from the clan houses and grave sites where the poles had stood in direct relationship with the clan crest they represented, placing them instead in the invented arrangement of a totem park. And 3, in legal terms at least, native owners relinquished title to their poles and handed them over as communal property of the village, in effect divorcing totem poles from the clan systems that had engendered them and relocating them as the property of collective town sites. Some scholars have argued that this requirement constituted a government appropriation of native heritage, since it required that natives relinquish title to their poles. However, what these scholars forget is that the CCC projects across the country had to occur on public property, since it was a New Deal program that used public tax dollars. So the Forest Service legally could not work on private property and had to require this transfer in order to receive federal funding. And in just a minute, I'll talk more about how Tlingit and Haida peoples actually intervened to retain ownership of the poles, but these were the official memorandum of agreements that were signed. Next slide, please. Once the MOAs were signed, the CCC had to remove totem poles from native villages to the CCC camps for restoration. Totem poles were floated behind ranger ships or sometimes boated on large barges. They were then unloaded onto the beach at high tide and dragged into the carving shed by hand. And here you can see they would have these totem poles. They would ship them along the water from other villages, bring them on the beach, and then they would have to actually bring them up to the carving sheds themselves. The next slide. In the carving shed, restoration work now began. If the pole had only minor places of rot, CCC workers restored it by replacing the rotten sections with newly carved splints. And I think in the next slide you can see here these lighter colored patches where they would insert newly carved plugs into some of the rotten parts of the pole. So that was a way of restoring the existing 19th century pole. They also used traditional hand tools, many of which either had been passed down through families of carvers or were recreated based on those traditional tools. And actually, I see Ethel Lund here in the audience, and she told me that her father, Thomas Eucas, who is a CCC head carver in Wrangell, had inherited his father's tools, William Eucas. And so there was a real emphasis on trying to use tools from the past in these new CCC replication projects. Next slide, please. If the pole was too decayed to restore, CCC workers made a replica by laying the original pole next to a new pole and carving it. So here you can see this older 19th century pole that was deemed too far gone to restore, and what they would do is get a new log and carve a replicated totem pole from that. You can see Charles Brown here using this, they would use measurement tapes, calipers to transfer measurements exactly from the original pole to the new pole. So they really worked hard to make exact replicas of the older poles. Next slide, please. Tlingit and Haida workers enrolled in the CCC were divided into 2 groups. Regular laborers were paid $2 a day. Lead carvers had $5.60 a day. So there was a big difference in pay, and in some ways it reflected the traditional divide between master carver and apprentice. Here you can see several of the master carvers involved in the CCC project. This was Joe Thomas of Wrangell, William Brown, who is the father of Charles Brown and Saxman, and here probably the most well-known of the CCC carvers is John Wallace of Heidelberg. And they worked with apprentices within the CCC to try to train them in some of the traditional form line designs. So in that way, I think the CCC really replicated the old apprentice master carver tradition. The next slide, please. Once the poles were completed, they were erected in 6 new totem parks in southeast Alaska. And all of this work, as you can see, was done by hand. Next slide. And of course, they had already had to build the totem parks as well, clearing the land, building roads and trestles, walkways and cribbing for the poles, etc. So here you can see in Saxman, this was the original totem row being built. They had to excavate all of this land, build the roads, staircases. They built a lot of cribbing for each totem pole. At Shakes Island and Wrangell, they built the trestle to get out to the island. So it was just a tremendous amount of work that I'm not sure has been fully recognized by what the Forest Service and the CCC carvers did. Next slide. The final step of the CCC restoration program was delayed because of World War II, but it was to attract tourists to the totem parks and to native art that would be sold there. The Forest Service originally wanted to build small shops adjacent to the totem parks where local artists could sell their work, although this plan was never realized with the entrance of the U.S. into war in December 1941. Next slide. However, I did find some evidence of model totem poles being made in the 1940s, like this one that is now at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. You can see this model totem pole was clearly modeled on the Sun Raven pole that's now in the Saxman Park, even including the small Forest Service sign that was placed at the base. So this is evidence that in the 1940s there were native artists who were trying to develop this native art market based around the totem parks, using model totem poles that would remind the tourist of their visit to the totem park itself. Next slide, please. So now we've come to the main questions I'd like to explore today. What role did Tlingit and Haida peoples play in the creation of the CCC Totem Parks? Yes, they were the main workers enrolled in the CCC, but what leadership roles did they assume in directing the parks and ensuring this government program still served their cultural needs? Current scholarship on the parks often labels the restoration program as government appropriation of native heritage, framing the totem parks as inauthentic sites invented by federal bureaucrats, largely for the benefit of tourists. Yet this construction ignores a much richer history of native peoples using the totem parks for their own cultural uses, and of the active role they played in shaping the totem parks as culturally relevant sites. It also ignores the role of individuals in the U.S. Forest Service who were genuinely interested in the preservation of native cultures for native peoples and who cooperated with native leaders to create totem parks that would benefit local native communities. So at this time, I want to show the 1949 film that I found this past spring. It was in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And I knew that there was a film out there somewhere because I kept seeing photographs in the Forest Service historical records of a film crew at the CCC parks. No one that I talked to in Alaska knew about this film, but Bruce Pelham up at National Archives in Anchorage suggested that perhaps back in DC they had kept some of the films and photographs, and sure enough, it was there this past spring. So this is an 11-minute newsreel from 1949. One thing I want to say about it is that unfortunately I don't think that this film represents the New Deal context in which the parks were originally created. Since it was created, the footage was taken during the 1930s, during the New Deal totem parks. But because of World War II, it was never edited and made into a film until 1949, which is a very different political context for federal relationships with Native peoples. This was termination era. This was the beginning of a lot of the contracts for pulp in the Tongass National Forest. So I think this would be a different film if it had been made in the 1930s. But anyway, I wanted to show it to you today, and we'll continue after that.
Sealaska, frontier land of rugged mountains, deep lakes, and mighty glaciers. Uncle Sam's largest national forest, the Tongass, occupies the southeastern section. Here grow managed forests, old trees ready for the harvest, and young ones growing for future crops. Enough Sitka spruce and western hemlock to support a system of mills that could produce 1 million tons of pulp every year, forever. Here forest rangers travel through picturesque waterways bordered by dense woods. Here, we sometimes find a deserted Indian village, almost lost in the tangled forest. Proud sentinels of the past, Indian totem poles are overgrown with vegetation. Once vivid with color, they are now drab and decayed, ravaged by time. With the coming of the great American fishing industry, the natives abandoned their totems to the elements. They built villages near the salmon galleries and adopted the ways of their neighbors. The art of totem carving was almost lost until the United States Forest Service helped revive it. Old poles were collected by the Civilian Conservation Corps, repaired, restored, or used as models for reproduction. Some of the older Indians, skillful wood carvers, were enrolled in the CCC to teach the younger men the craft of their fathers. Fine cedar trees, famous for lightweight, durability, and easy carving, were felled and floated to convenient locations. Some were 4 feet in diameter and over 60 feet long. After being roughly shaped, outlines of the figures were drawn from overlaid patterns. Then, the carver sharpened his hands, like the one used by his forefathers, and set to work. The sculptor donned his ceremonial robes. He made skillful use of a crude chisel. With the blade of an old-fashioned knife, he carved the grotesque figures slowly, carefully. Bright coloring was next applied. In ancient days, the Indians made their paint by chewing salmon eggs to obtain albumin. This was mixed with powdered copper for green, baked clam shells for white. After the totem poles were finished, they were placed at Ketchikan, Wrangell, and in the Sitka National Monument, also in the Indian towns of Heidelberg, Tlingit, and Yucatan. Today, thousands of tourists enjoy the rugged beauty of the Alaskan National Forests and these colorful poles. Here are carved tribal legends, family history, or symbols of a chief's wealth and prestige. The emblem at the top, usually a bird or animal, indicates the family clan. The commemorative or genealogical pole often stood in front of the home. This one is called 2-in-1 grizzly bear. 3 bear cubs and their mother ornament the trunk. Here is the Secretary of State pole, in honor of Secretary Seward, who purchased Alaska from Russia. The Secretary is sitting on a box of furs, a gift of the Indians. Very unusual is the Lincoln pole, carved in honor of the great emancipator and the the abolition of slavery among the Indian tribes. The original Lincoln figure is in the Territorial Museum in Juneau. Single figures were often carved on mortuary or grave totems. Ashes of the dead were placed in cedar boxes in the back of weird images, such as this Alaskan brown bear. And this killer whale. In the heart of Ketchikan stands the Chief Johnson pole. It tells of the creation of salmon by the daughter of the frog. The small faces are those of two slaves. They indicate wealth. Here, 3 frogs represent women of the Frog clan who married slaves and lost their social standing. The totem ridicules the chief of the clan for not restoring the women to their former state. Indian children never tire of hearing the old stories, handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. This eagle with a human body represents a boy who spent all his time feeding eagles. When the tribe was starving, this kindness was repaid by the many salmon brought in by the eagles. The giant rock oyster totem tells of an Indian whose hand was caught by a giant oyster, so that he was doomed by the incoming tide. This tired wolf bull recalls a wolf who was adopted by the clan and helped them with their fishing. Every people has its own version of Jackson. The sun and raven pole describes how light was brought into the world and presents the story of the flood. The raven is being followed by the 3 children of the sun. The large face is that of the raven's mother. The raven, following the frog, is descending into the sea. This beaver totem once supported the roof of a community house. The Forest Service and the Civilian Conservation Corps helped reconstruct 3 Indian community houses. This one stands at Totem Park near Ketchikan. The massive buildings are really one-room apartment houses, made entirely of western red cedar. This one has but a single entrance, no windows, and only a smoke hole in the roof. No nails, not a bit of iron was used. 40 people ate and slept within its walls. The Indians approaching this community house at Wrangell are wearing chill-cap blankets of mountain goat wool and cedar bark dyed with juices squeezed from hemlock bark and lichens. Erection of a totem pole or community house calls for a celebration. This is a potlatch and ceremonial dance. Rattles and drums are the native instruments. This dance is a tribute to the Civilian Conservation Corps and the government for reviving the ancient art of totem carving, unique among the arts of the world. Totem Land is but one of the many interesting sights of southeastern Alaska, a country that still challenges the pioneer spirit, now accessible by air, as well as by sea. A vast unpeopled domain, a tremendous national forest, timber waiting to be felled and hauled to the mills, extensive salmon runs, minerals in the mountains, and roaring waterfalls ready to be harnessed for electric power. Your Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska, land of timber and totem poles, where nature has so much to offer Americans, today and for hundreds of years to come.
So there are some inaccuracies in this film, this newsreel. The Seward poll, for example, that they discussed in Saxman was not to honor the Secretary of State, but to ridicule him for not repaying that box of furs. And some offensive things like grotesque figures, weird figures, this kind of thing. But I think what's significant to recognize is that the Forest Service did dedicate so much of a film on the Tongass National Forest to these CCC parks. Oh, thank you. Can you hear me better now? I think it is significant that the Forest Service dedicated so much of the film to the CCC parks, and that there was a real effort to educate the American public about what totem poles were, that they weren't just these heathen objects, but that they were actually used as clan crests to proclaim clan identities and serve as memorial functions. So one major part missing from the film, of course, is the role of Tlingit and Haida peoples in directing the parks, rather than simply cooperating with or following the lead of the government program. So in the final part of my talk today, I want to address this issue with some examples of how Tlingit and Haida leaders actively directed and intervened in the totem parks to ensure they were suitable for their own cultural uses. Such evidence points to a much richer history than has been previously allowed for the CCC parks, one that is not simply about government appropriation of Native heritage or government relief programs for Native peoples, but one where Tlingit and Haida leaders found ways to work with the Forest Service to ensure the parks were authentic sites for their own culture. Next slide, please. The first point I want to make is that Tlingit and Haida individuals, as well as the Alaska Native Brotherhood, actively worked to obtain relief for Alaska Natives during the Depression, rather than being the passive beneficiaries of that relief. It's important to note that the CCC originally would not hire Alaska Natives, and it was only after a lot of lobbying by the A&B that in 1937 the CCC began to hire Alaska Natives. And here at Sealaska Heritage Collections, I found this note in the 1935 minutes from the A&B Grand Camp. If you could go to the next slide. William Paul moved protesting against the CCC director in Alaska, Charles Flory's discrimination against Indians in CCC work. They listed examples, and then they were going to make this a resolution that they wanted the CCC to hire Alaska Natives. The next slide, please. There was also this resolution in the records here, where the A&B and ANS and Convention asked Congress to consider a larger appropriation for the relief of destitute Natives in Alaska. This was the Depression. It hit everyone hard. And so here again, you can see they actually sent a copy of this resolution straight to the President Roosevelt. So there was this really active effort to alert officials to the predicament of Native peoples and to get CCC relief in Alaska. Next slide. Another point is that in several communities, it was local residents who actually requested the totem pole restoration program for their communities, that it wasn't just kind of bestowed upon them. This was a letter I found from Kisan resident Raymond Jones from 1938, and he sent it, as you can see, to the Indian Affairs Director here in Alaska, Charles Hawksworth. The letter said, "The fishing season has just come to an end. The people of this village have not earned enough to keep them through the coming winter. There's a desperate need for relief this winter. If there's any way you can help us, we'll appreciate it very much. Mr. Leonard Allen of Ketchikan suggested that the totems at Old Kisan be repaired. He believed that the Parks Department would allow the Forest Service through the CCC to do the repairs. This is a good, worthwhile project, and we wish the Indian Office would look into this idea." So here in Kisan, they actively asked for that totem pole restoration program to come to them, and the Forest Service did agree that Kisan needed the park. The next slide, please. A third point is that for these communities, I believe the totem parks did serve as a new way to memorialize ancestors, to memorialize clan crests as they had been. Here you can see a marble grave marker that was taken from Pennock Island and was placed in the totem park at Saxman. Even though it was not originally on the Forest Service list to be included in the totem park, there were several families who petitioned to have their clan crests and grave markers included in the park. And I think that this shows that Tlingit and Haida people viewed these new invented contexts of the totem parks as new ways to have a memorial function of crest markers and totem poles. And actually there were several other families in Kasan as well, and in Wrangell that included some of their crest markers in the totem parks. Next slide, please. A fourth point is that the totem parks allowed government-sanctioned potlatching and the succession of hitsati, or chiefs as they're more commonly known. Here you can see there were actually several potlatches associated with the dedication of totem parks. At Heidelberg, Klawock, they had potlatches, and probably the most famous was in Wrangell. June 3rd and 4th in 1940, they had the Wrangell potlatch, and it was to celebrate the dedication of the CCC Totem Park and also to install Charlie Jones as Chief Shakes VII. So Tlingit and Haida peoples used the dedication of a park to further their own cultural traditions. If I could have the next slide. Here you can see Charlie Jones, who was going to be named Chief Shakes VII. It was a huge write-up. They invited people, dignitaries from across the US. Next slide, please. They had an organizing committee consisting of natives. Tommy Yukis was here, also non-natives, so it was a very collaborative effort within Wrangell to get people to come. The number of people who came actually doubled Wrangell's population for the days that it was there. So it was a massive event. People were very excited to celebrate this new park. Next slide, please. What was very exciting was that so many people came out with regalia, and I'm not sure when some of that regalia had last come out for a potlatch, but you can see people from Cake, Juneau, Ketchikan. They had all been personally invited by Chief Shakes. He had sent out emissaries in the traditional way to invite them to this potlatch. And people came in droves wearing regalia. Here we have Tommy Yukis on the left. The Lund guessed this might be Mary Miyasato, but if anyone recognizes anyone in these pictures, I'd love to know. Next slide. And the kind of crowning event of the Wrangell potlatch was the naming of Chief Shakes VII in the A&B hall at the end of the dedication ceremony. And you can see there were natives and non-natives gathered here to witness this new ceremony. So even though the totem parks were this kind of invented new context for totem poles, I just want to emphasize that they were used by Tlingit and Haida peoples for more of these traditional clan reasons. Next slide. I'd also wanted to point out, in current scholarship, one of the misperceptions is that the Forest Service wanted to create all the totem parks in large towns along the tourist route. And in fact, close study of Forest Service correspondence shows that for some parks at least, it was native leaders who actually wanted the totem parks to be created in their communities. If you could go to the next slide, I'll come back to that one in a second. This was a letter I found very early in the Totem Pole Project, 1937, and it's Charles Burdick stating, if totem poles have to be moved to central locations, they should be centralized at one of the larger towns where more tourists stop. This, however, is not the intention of the rehabilitation work by the CCC. The location of the poles at their original locations is preferable. So originally the Forest Service did want to preserve poles in places like Sakwan, Klinkwan, Haukan, and it was later, if we go to the next slide, that they got the idea to actually move the poles to centralized locations. And in the Forest Service correspondence, I found a note from C.M. Archbold, who took a picture. I'm sorry, it's kind of a poor image here. I had a photocopy. But this is Paul Morrison, who is the mayor of Heidelberg. And it was Morrison who suggested, actually, that he wanted one park made from totem poles at Haukan, Klinkwan, and Sakwan. So if you could go to the next slide. Let's go to one more. Here it is. In discussing the question of restoring these poles, Mr. Morrison suggested that we clear a location in Heidelberg and reconstruct an old native village there by bringing in the best totems from Sukwang, Tlingit, and Haukan. This suggestion was his own idea, and he mentioned that since Heidelberg is made up of natives from these 3 villages, that permission for moving the totems could be easily secured. So again, this was a native leader, Paul Morrison in Heidelberg, who wanted that centralized park. And the Forest Service agreed to make that park in Heidelberg rather than restore poles in situ. Next slide, please. It was also native leaders like Paul Morrison who wanted these centralized parks to be in native villages where they had title. Remember that on the Memorandum of Agreement, the totem poles had to be re-erected on public land. But there was a great deal of leeway on what that public land could be. It could be National Forest Service land, or it could be town site land. And it's very interesting to me that at Klawock, Heidelberg, and Kasan, native leaders lobbied to have the totem parks on town site land where native peoples had title. So this would be a way that they could achieve some ownership of the poles. You can see here this was a plan showing the blocks, block 38, block 39. These were blocks that the Heidelberg Town Council allotted for the totem park, and the Forest Service then placed the poles there. So this was on town site land where native peoples had title. Okay, next slide, please. And I think ultimately, it's very significant that the parks today do serve cultural uses for Tlingit and Haida communities across Southeast Alaska. As Dr. Worrell said at the beginning, there is a new movement to restore some of the CCC poles in the parks and to make the parks kind of continually useful for local communities. So Heidelberg, as many of you probably know, they've restored poles every year at the end of their Haida Culture Camp. This is a new pole going up. It was carved by the Young brothers, and their grandfather was Claude Morrison, who was actually one of the CCC carvers in Heidelberg, and he was there to see this pole raised. So, next slide. Here are the Young brothers as new carvers here. This was Claude Morrison seated there. He passed away this past year. Next slide. Here we have Lee Wallace, who is the grandson of John Wallace. I showed you a photo of him as a head carver earlier. Benjamin Young, grandson of the CCC enrollee Claude Morrison. So I think there really has been this legacy of the CCC that made these new kind of controversial contexts for a new totem park, but that these parks have now become really part of Tlingit and Haida communities. The people I've talked to are very proud of these totem parks, and they really are important sites for them. Next slide. In Klawock, we have John Rowan leading students from his Native art class at the high school in restoring totem poles for their park. Kasan, as many of you know, are trying to restore the whale house, which I really hope will happen. And then these are some last photos of the parks. So in conclusion, let me find this piece. For the Forest Service, the parks made good on the agency's mission statement to restore resources in the Tongass National Forest and to administer the relief programs of the CCC. For Tlingit and Haida peoples, the parks provided immediate relief work, but also a more long-term means of honoring ancestors and teaching stories and pride in the totem poles themselves. In keeping with their ideas of ha-shuka, ancestors and future generations would benefit from the park's restoration of totem poles. The totem parks offered a new way to honor culture, one that was not traditional perhaps, but a way that blended tradition with the reality of contemporary Tlingit and Haida life. Thus, Tlingit and Haida leaders ensured that a government program they had worked to obtain also contributed to the cultural life of communities for future generations. Thank you very much. Those are just last pictures. If anyone recognized anyone in the photos, or you have comments or questions, I would love to learn from you. So we'll open this up to questions.